Okay, good morning everyone. We have a very important shiur today. Today's shiur is dedicated by our dear friend Rabbi Gordon Zisholtz in honor of the upcoming yahrzeit of his father,
Gershom ben
Yechiel David, whose yahrzeit is on Lag BaOmer. Halevi. Gershom ben Yechiel David Halevi, whose yahrzeit is on Lag BaOmer. Should be a male yosher for his whole family, for Simchas Hanachas Ad Bias Goel Tzedek. Yesterday after Mincha, we discussed the amazing question of the Chasam Sofer in the Tshuvas Chasam Sofer, Siman Shin Nun Vav. Who remembers the question? Just for you, the question is, the Chasam Sofer says, in his view, no one could seriously consider that the belief in the coming of Moshiach is one of the tenets of Judaism. You hear this question? Why? Because what's the definition of an ikar? An ikar is something that the rest of the edifice stands on. You can't argue that the belief in the coming of Mashiach is a fundamental principle that all the rest of the Torah stands on. I understand the belief in Hashem is a principle upon which the whole binyan stands on. Divine providence is a principle upon which all the mitzvahs stand on. The divine origin of the Torah is a principle upon which all the mitzvahs stand on. But how could you say the coming of Mashiach is a principle upon which the rest of the edifice stands on? Let's say, heaven forbid, we would be in Gullus forever and God, so to speak, has permanently severed ties with us. We still have to keep all 613 mitzvahs. Now, it says the Chasam Sofer, this is not to say that if you don't believe in Mashiach, you're not a kofer. Of course you're a heretic if you don't believe in the coming of Mashiach. If you don't believe in Makas Tzvardeya, you're also a kofer. If you don't believe in the pasuk Achois Loitan Timna is not divinely given, you're also a kofer. If you don't believe in any Kutzah Shel Yud, you're a kofer. The question, though, the Chasam Sofer raises is, why would the belief in the coming of Mashiach be one of the principles of faith? Yesterday we offered two approaches to explain why the coming of Mashiach could be a principle of faith. To this morning I want to share with you, because before we wrap up the subject of Tzipisa Yeshua, which I want to remind you, do you have your handy bookmarks of the 14 times in davening you could await the coming of Mashiach? You have it? Take more. You have? Rabbi Menachem, you have enough bookmarks? Give Menachem. Well, he could give him two. Take. So this morning we want to explain. Give Gordon a bunch. Okay. This morning we're trying to explain the opinion of the Chasam Sofer. Again, yesterday we tried to explain what the pshat in the Rambam is, why in fact that the belief in the coming of Mashiach is one of the principles of faith. But how do we explain the Chasam Sofer? The Chasam Sofer says he doesn't believe that anyone actually holds it's an ikar. What do you mean he doesn't believe? The Rambam said it. So I want to share with you this morning, I think it's clear that the Chasam Sofer's position is based on the Shita of the Abarbanel in the Sefer Rosh Amana. You know, the Abarbanel wrote a Sefer about Bias HaMashiach. He wrote a trilogy, 3 volumes, on the coming of Mashiach. Rosh Amana. He wrote Yeshuas Mashiachai. He wrote 3 volumes on the coming of Mashiach. And the Abarbanel gets into the machlokes between the Rambam and the Sefer HaIkrim regarding the principles of faith. We know the Rambam set forth 13 principles of faith, and the Sefer Ikrim says there are only 3 principles of faith: the reality of God, divine providence, and the divine origin of the Torah. And therefore the Sefer Ikrim asks on the Rambam many questions. For example, the Sefer Ikrim asks on the Rambam, how could the belief in Mashiach be one of the Ikrim? There's an Amoira in Shas, Rav Hillel and Sanhedrin, Daf Tzadik Tes. You know, Rav Hillel says there's no Mashiach. So ask the Sefer Ikrim, so what? The Rambam would say Rav Hillel was an apikoros? So clearly the Sefer Ikrim says that the belief in Mashiach is not one of the Ikrim. Which, by the way, the Chasam Sofer says all Rav Hillel meant was not that there is no Mashiach, but that Mashiach is not a person. Hashem will redeem us. But the Chasam Sofer says, but if anyone today were to say that Mashiach is not a person, Hashem will redeem us, they would be an apikoros, because we don't paskin like Rav Hillel. But still, the Chasam Sofer argues that nobody would really seriously maintain that belief in Mashiach is one of the principles of faith. So the question is, but the Rambam said so. The Rambam said that. So what, the Chasam Sofer doesn't believe the Rambam said that? The Rambam wrote Yud Gimel Ikrim. So I want to share with you the opinion of the Abarbanel. We once learned it in a shiur on Parshas Bahaloischa, and I reviewed it last night, and it's very worthwhile to remember this. The Abarbanel mentions that the Rambam codifies Yud Gimel Ikrim. But does anybody know where the Rambam codified the Yud Gimel Ikrim? In his commentary to the Mishnah on Masechta Sanhedrin. So the Abarbanel starts by saying, what does that mean there are 13 principles of faith? If anyone questions any mitzvah in the Torah, let's say somebody says, I don't believe in tzitzis, I don't believe in shatnez, I don't believe in any mitzvah, what do we call such a person? They're not purest. What if somebody denies one pasuk in the Chumash? They're a heretic. What if somebody denies one letter in the Chumash? They're a heretic. So that means every letter is an ikar. You can't say one principle is more fundamental than another principle. Question asks the Abarbanel. He says, didn't Hillel say, V'ahavta l'reacha kamaycha? I'm sorry, didn't Rabbi Akiva say, Ze klal gadol b'Torah in this week's Parsha? We read it in Kedoshim. It's the general principle of the whole Torah. Is that one of the Yud Gimel Ikrim? Do we say, Ani mamin be'emunah shalema, that chayiv adam lehoiv chaveroi kenafshay? That's not one of the Yud Gimel Ikrim. So therefore, says the Abarbanel, that we have to be mamelitz for the Rambam. The Rambam never intended to make ikarim and yesodais. The proof is, says Abarbanel, we're going to learn 4 proofs, but the Rambam did not incorporate Talmud Torah as one of the Yud Gimel Ikrim, but Talmud Torah is the most important mitzvah. The most important mitzvah in the Torah is learning. Why isn't that one of the Yud Gimel Ikrim? Says Abarbanel, you need to understand this historically. When did the Rambam write his commentary to the Mishnah? When he was a young man. What language did he write it in? He wrote it in Arabic. Who did he write it for? Lihiyasher anoshim asher lo hemiku b'Torah v'lo lamdu v'lo shimshu daitzarkam. The Rambam wrote it for people who are not learned, who don't learn Gemara. All they learn is Mishnah. And he wanted to give them some basic ideas of Judaism. But it is in no way authoritative. It has no standing halachically or even al pi machshava. Al pi machshava, there is no real concept of 13 principles of faith, says Abarbanel. Says Abarbanel, did anybody ever read the Mar Nevuchim? The Rambam doesn't say one word about 13 principles of faith in Mar Nevuchim. Which is more important, his commentary to the Mishnah or Mar Nevuchim? By far, says Abarbanel, Mar Nevuchim is much more important. The Rambam wrote Mar Nevuchim when he was already a seasoned sage. He wrote his Parsha to the Mishnah when he was a young man. He did it b'na'arusai. Who did he write it for? The Hamoin Am. L'maschilim, to the beginners who are learning Mishnayos. The Rambam never wrote Yud Gimel Ikrim for those who are mamik b'yedias ho'amitis. That his main work is the Mar Nevuchim and not his Parsha HaMishnayos. And therefore, the Sefer HaIkrim and Rav Chazdoi Krashkras, who ask on the Rambam, why did you count 13 Ikrim? You should have only made 13. Says Abarbanel, they made a big error. The error they made was they thought the Rambam really was codifying Yud Gimel Ikrim. There is no real concept of 13 principles of faith. It is not a fundamental idea. It doesn't really exist. Says Abarbanel, Bebechinas ha'emes kulam ikarim. In truth, every mitzvah is an ikar. If you don't believe in any detail of the Torah, it's heresy. There is no real concept of 13 principles of faith. And then the Abarbanel brings 4 proofs. Proof number 1. If there were really 13 fundamental principles of faith upon which everything else stood on, then why didn't Hashem communicated to Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai? He should have given 13 commandments, and they should be, there's a God, He has no physical parts, He's all-knowing, He's all-powerful, He speaks to man. Moshe's prophecy is the greatest of all the prophets. There will be Mashiach, there will be Tchias HaMesim, there's reward and punishment. And yet in the 10 commandments, there's only 1 or 2 of the 13 principles of faith. You know why? Because there's no such thing as 13 principles of faith. It's not a fundamental idea in Judaism that they're principles of faith. If it were, God would have told Moshe Rabbeinu in the 10 commandments. Another proof, says Abarbanel, if there were really 13 principles of faith upon which the rest of the Torah stood, then they should have been outlined in the beginning of Bereshis, and then from there we would get the rest of all the details. In other words, if there were principles of faith upon which the rest of the Torah stands, then Hashem should have said, Bereshis bara Elokim, in the beginning God created, I know what you're thinking, I reward you, I punish you, I last forever, I was first and I'm last. There's prophecy, but nothing was ever communicated, not in the 10 commandments and not in the beginning of the Torah. Number 3, if they're really principles of faith, what is the punishment for somebody who says, I don't believe God was first, I believe the Son came first? What do we do to such a person? Nothing. What do we do to somebody who we warn him not to wear shatnez and he wears shatnez? We give him lashes. So if there were really 13 principles of faith, how does it make sense that the punishment for violating a lav is worse than a punishment for violating one of the 13 principles of faith? If somebody violates a lav in the Torah, they get punished. And yet, many of the principles of faith, there's no punishment if somebody doesn't believe in them. That indicates there is no real concept of principles of faith at all. And number 4, says Abarbanel, and maybe the strongest raya of all, is that if there were 13 principles of faith, why do we not find anywhere in any Gemara that there are Ikarei Emunah? Not in Brachos, not in Sanhedrin, nowhere. God in the Chazal never told us their principles of faith. The answer is the Rambam created it. He innovated it when he was a young man for people who are not learned. But it has no real standing, not al pi halacha, not al pi chazal, and not really in Jewish thought altogether. So when we learned the Chasam Sofer's question, that he doesn't believe that anyone really maintains that there are 13 principles of faith, so we asked, what do you mean he doesn't believe? The Rambam said it. No. The Chasam Sofer knows this Abarbanel, I would maintain. He knows the Rambam didn't really outline it for learned Jews. He did it for people who don't really have background. We have to give them some basic concepts. That's the explanation of the Chasam Sofer, in my humble opinion. Those are the 4 proofs that the Abarbanel brings, that the Rambam never really meant it. Again, they are, if they were really 13 ikrim, number 1, it would be in the Aseres HaDibros. Number 2, it would be in the beginning of the Torah. Number 3, there would be punishment for it, even more than other lavin. And number 4, Chazal don't say anything about it. This is what the Abarbanel writes in the Sefer Rosh Amana, Perek Chav Gimel, page 138. By the way, a little bit earlier, the Abarbanel brought another proof, namely that there can't really be 13 ikrim. What about great principles like remembering that God gave the Torah to the Jewish people? What about the principle of Yahavta l'recha kamaycha? What about any of the mitzvah? What about v'asisa hayashar v'hatoiv? To act in a just and courteous manner. Why isn't that an ikr? The answer is the Rambam was just saying general ideas. It doesn't really have specific significance. That, I believe, is where the Chasam Sofer is coming from, based on this Abarbanel. So that is the first thing I wanted to bring to your attention this morning. And I'm going to make another... you mentioned how should we view the 13 principles. Again, according to the Abarbanel, and according to the Chasam Sofer, they don't have significance. It's just nice to know them. On the other hand, Reb Chaim Brisker said that there is a significance to them, namely, what we mentioned yesterday after Mincha, that when it comes to other mitzvahs, if you don't know it because you never had the opportunity to learn it, so you're not an apikaya. Let's say somebody doesn't wear tzitzis because they never learned about tzitzis, then the person would not be an apikayas. But if somebody doesn't believe in the resurrection of the dead because they never learned about it, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik says they would be a heretic. So there is a machloikis whether the Yud Gimel Ikrim have halachic significance. Again, the Abarbanel says they do not. The Chasam Sofer says they do not. And they sort of say the Rambam never really meant it. And the Rambam wrote it in Arabic. And the Rambam wrote it when he was a young man. And it's not meant as a definitive viewpoint. On the other hand, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik seemed to have said that there is halachic significance specifically to the Yud Gimel Ikrim, but that's certainly how the Sefer HaIkrim understood the Rambam, and that's certainly how the Rabbeinu Chazdai Krash understood the Rambam. So you have these two views about the Sefer Yud Gimel Ikrim. Okay, I want to share with you